Now let's take a look at how to create a stored procedure. Similar to views, you're going to create a stored procedure by just simply calling create, or if you wanted to modify one, alter. You'll use the keyword procedure. As a real quick side note, you can use proc. I'm not a fan of that. I always like typing everything out, but you can use proc here instead of procedure. Then you'll notice the name, and then any parameters that you might have. We'll talk about parameters in just a moment. And then the with options, which we'll also talk about in a moment. Then you've got the as statement, and then from there on forward, you can pretty much do almost anything that you might want inside of a stored procedure in regards to modifying data. So if you need to be able to do an insert, you need to be able to do an update, you need to be able to do a delete, you need to be able to do select, go back and do another insert, whatever it is that you might need to do to make everything happen, you can do that inside of a stored procedure. And then, of course, if you want to get rid of a stored procedure, it's simply drop procedure and then specify its name. Stored procedures have the following options. First is encryption. Encryption will encrypt the definition inside of syscomments. Now, just like before, we've got some issues here. That nobody's going to be able to access it. It's always going to be based on the last execution. So if you say alter procedure and you forget to put in the with encryption, it's not going to be encrypted when it's stored. And then on top of all of that, there are hacks for the encryption that's being used behind the scenes. So it's really not a, generally speaking, good practice. You also have with execute as. Now, this is a little bit of an advanced option because what it's going to allow you to do is execute a stored procedure as a different user. And this can be very helpful when I may need to change permissions to access a different database, access a different table, where maybe ownership and different things like that behind the scenes have changed. The last option that we have is recompile. And recompile will tell SQL to recompile the stored procedure after every use. Now, this is again one of those advanced options, and it's generally speaking not something that I want to turn on. The reason for that is because, well, one of the biggest reasons that I'll be using stored procedures is to let SQL pre-compile everything for me, which can help improve performance. If I'm doing recompile, I'm telling SQL to get rid of that cache and start over again and again and again. Now, sometimes that can actually be exactly what I want, but it's not going to be that frequent. So this is an advanced option, and generally speaking, not something you want to reach for. The last little thing that we want to highlight is our parameters. When you create a parameter, what you're going to do is specify two pieces of information very similar to a variable. You're going to give it a name, put an @ sign in front of it. You're going to specify a data type, and then finally, you can add on a couple of other options. For example, if I want it to be an output parameter, I can specify the keyword out or output after it. And output parameters allow us to return back an individual value to the caller. Now, the one little catch about output parameters is that you always have to account for it, is the way that I like to put it. Or in other words, what I need to do when I'm calling this is I need to create a variable and pass that into the code that I'm using to call that stored procedure along with the keyword out. As a result, I'm generally speaking not a fan of output parameters. And as a real quick aside for any of the developers that are out there, again, I'm not a big fan of this because what I have to do is first put the parameter into the command object that I'm using, and then I need to call that back out. So I just find, for the most part, that output parameters just create more work. Last but not least, you can also specify a default value, and you'll do this by just simply setting the name equal to whatever the default value is. The last little thing that I want to note about stored procedures is that it is possible to return a value back with a stored procedure by using the return keyword. Now, if all that you need to do is send out a table, you do that just by executing a select statement. But if you wanted to return a value, maybe for example a status code, you can do that by using a return parameter. Now again, like I said before, I'm generally speaking not a big fan of this. And the reason for that is because of the fact that it, again, requires that I have to account for that. And if I'm creating code, that I have to then create the parameter, put that in, read that back out. Generally speaking, I much prefer just to select the data that I want to return. In fact, let's take a look at how we could do that. In our demonstration, what I'm going to do is take a look at how we could create a stored procedure that will create a brand new category and then return that back.